Today, I bring you a charming new mystery featuring none other than the brilliant Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous Belgian detective, created by Agatha Christie. This case is filled with twists, clever clues, and Poirot's signature little grey cells at work. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now let's get started. It was on a brisk Friday morning that I found myself once again in the company of my old friend, Hercule Poirot, as we trundled along in a motor car bound for the English countryside. The sun flickered through the trees in polite beams, and the road twisted just enough to keep one slightly alert. Though, truth be told, I was already weary from Poirot's lecture on the psychology of chess players. "You see, Hastings," he said, adjusting his silk cravat, "the man who chooses the bishop's gambit over the queen's initiative, he reveals his soul. Ah, but no matter. Today, we are not concerned with kings or pawns." We were en route to Fernley Court, the restored Victorian manor recently purchased by Mr. Mortimer Blaine, an American entrepreneur who had made his fortune in audio technology and avant-garde media. Blaine had extended a rather curious invitation to Poirot, accompanied by a note that read, "You may find my collection worth your time, and perhaps even your little grey cells." The manor revealed itself at the end of a winding drive, majestic yet slightly self-conscious in its modern renovations. Steel fixtures gleamed beside ivy-covered walls, and what once must have been a drawing room now featured smoked glass panels and abstract sculptures. As we stepped out of the car, a butler in a white linen jacket appeared with silent efficiency. "Mr. Blaine is expecting you in the East Wing," he announced with a nod. His voice oddly softened, as though muffled by invisible curtains. Poirot smiled graciously, tipped his hat, and whispered to me, "Mon ami, I do believe we walk into a house of echoes." Mr. Mortimer Blaine was, without doubt, one of the most striking men I had ever encountered. He had the air of a man who had conquered several industries and now wished to conquer time itself. His suit was crisp, American cut, his beard trimmed like an aging artist who had never quite left Greenwich Village. "You'll pardon the mess," he said, gesturing to a room that looked anything but untidy. "This manor's bones are Victorian, but I've wired the place with state-of-the-art recording tech. Can't abide silence, you know. Too easy to imagine things." He led us through what must once have been a parlour, now transformed into an acoustic chamber lined with vintage recording equipment, Edison cylinders, lacquer discs, early tape reels, all displayed like sacred relics. "This," he said, placing his hand reverently on a glass-encased phonograph, "was used to record the last performance of Margot Ellery, before she vanished in Vienna. And this," he lifted a delicate reel, "this one captured the final breaths of a mountain climber before he froze to death in Tibet." Poirot, who had been eyeing the equipment with fascination, raised a brow. "And you find these recordings inspirational?" Blaine grinned. "Everything is sound, Monsieur Poirot. Emotions, memories, death. It all leaves a trace if you know how to capture it." I must confess I shuddered slightly. There was something eerie about his tone, too reverent, too possessive. Poirot, however, remained calm. "Ah, but Monsieur Blaine, beware. Sometimes, when you listen too closely, you hear what you are not meant to hear." That evening, just before dinner, Mr. Blaine gathered his guests, an eclectic mix of artists, academics, and aristocrats, into what he called the sound salon. The lights dimmed automatically, and the hum of hidden speakers filled the air. "I want to play you something special," Blaine announced, his voice charged with theatricality. It's not part of my collection. It arrived anonymously last week in an unmarked envelope. The room grew still. Someone chuckled nervously. He placed the reel onto the player and pressed a button. A static crackle filled the air. Then came it, the unmistakable sound of heavy, labored breathing, rasping, fragile, as though torn from a failing body. And then, softly, almost as a whisper, a voice. He killed me. The room collectively gasped. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. A woman dropped her wine glass. Blaine turned off the recording. I don't know where it came from, and I swear to you, it's not a trick. Poirot said nothing. He stood, arms crossed, staring not at the player, but at Blaine himself. Later, as we retired to our rooms, Poirot leaned in close to me and said, "Tell me, Hastings, why do people always believe a voice when they would doubt a face?" "Because it sounds real, I suppose," I replied, still unsettled. "Precisely," he whispered, "and therefore it is the perfect weapon." We were awakened in the middle of the night by a commotion. Mr. Blaine had been found dead in his study, collapsed beside the very same phonograph, which was still playing the chilling tape on an endless loop. Poirot bent low beside the machine, then straightened. "Non," he murmured. "A man's final breath cannot lie, but it can be made to speak at the wrong moment." And with that, the case truly began. It was in the small hours of the morning that a violent knock upon my door roused me from a dream of great absurdity involving a rhinoceros and a tea party. One of those dreams that Hastings' subconscious occasionally served up without explanation. I sprang from the bed and flung the door open to find a maid, her face pale as old linen. "Sir, Mr. Blaine, he's been found." Poirot, already fully dressed in his robe and slippers, appeared beside me like a cat from the shadows. "Where?" he asked, calm as a man asking for toast. "In the study, monsieur. It's locked from the inside." No answer. The sound. The same sound. It's still playing. We hurried along the carpeted corridor, the silence punctuated only by the scuffling feet of a half-awake butler and two guests wrapped in dressing gowns. The study door stood shut, heavy oak and brass gleaming in the dim hall light. The butler had fetched a key. The door opened with an ominous click. There, slumped in the leather wing chair by the phonograph, was Mortimer Blaine, his body tilted at an unnatural angle, one hand stretched toward the machine. His face was frozen in an expression that I can only describe as startled. The room was filled with that same ghastly recording, the raspy breathing, followed by the barely audible whisper, "He killed me." Poirot stepped forward, frowning not at the corpse, but at the looping reel that turned with robotic rhythm. He bent over the machine, clicked it off, and stood in silence for a long moment. "Locked from within," I murmured. "Must have been a heart attack, surely." Poirot straightened and gave me a curious look. "Mon ami," he said gravely, "a man may die from fear. But I believe this fear was manufactured." The coroner was summoned and declared with professional certainty that Mr. Blaine had succumbed to a sudden cardiac failure. His medical records corroborated the condition. No signs of struggle, no marks on the body, and a locked door, a textbook case, as one constable put it, of a man whose heart simply gave out. But Poirot, as ever, was unimpressed with textbooks. We stood outside the study later that morning, watching the constable escort the body to the coroner's van. Poirot's arms were folded behind his back, and he regarded the retreating figure of the late Mr. Blaine as though it were a riddle written in flesh. "It is too neat," he murmured. "I rather thought it was tragic," I replied. "But it seems straightforward." The man had a weak heart and a flair for the dramatic. That recording was enough to send anyone into a panic, let alone someone in his condition. Poirot turned to me, eyes gleaming. But that is the very point, Hastings. Why would a man who surrounds himself with death and breathes in the drama of suffering suddenly be undone by his own fascination? I blinked. You mean he wouldn't be frightened by the tape? Exactament. And yet he dies, alone, in his locked study, while listening to a recording that he claimed not to have made and could not identify. Poirot tapped the side of his head. And what of the timing? The coincidence? You think someone intended to frighten him to death? Poirot raised a finger. I do not think, mon ami. I suspect. We returned to the study. Poirot paced slowly about the room, occasionally pausing to touch the phonograph, to peer at the lock, to examine the window latches. Everything in this room speaks of the man's taste, he said. The leather chair, the brandy on the sideboard, the soundproofed walls. And yet, something else spoke last night. Not a man, a lie. A lie made of breath and whisper. He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. Hastings, we have stepped into a murder. Only the weapon, it is invisible. It is sound. It was a dismal sort of morning at Fernley Court, the sky low and sullen, as if mirroring the shadow that had settled over the estate following Mr. Blaine's death. The constables had made their inquiries, the coroner had given his pronouncement, and the local press had been fed the convenient version of events, natural causes, tragic but unsuspicious. But Hercule Poirot was not one to be lulled by simplicity. Come, Hastings, he said after breakfast, dabbing his lips with a cloth napkin. Let us take a stroll, yes? I wish to smell the flowers and the lies. We began our quiet inquiries under the guise of polite condolence visits, beginning with the guests who had shared that strange weekend at Fernley. First was Mrs. Daphne Wren, a statuesque woman of about 60, with piercing eyes and a voice like dry silk. She had once been a celebrated inventor in the field of acoustic engineering, though her public presence had faded since a well-publicized legal battle against Mortimer Blaine himself. She sued him over a patent, Poirot whispered as we approached her. A clever device, intended to simulate the sounds of nature for therapeutic use. Blaine acquired it, how shall we say, dubiously. Then there was Vincent Leary, a lean, nervy fellow who looked perpetually startled by his own thoughts. A former partner of Blaine's in a sound design company, Leary had left after what he cryptically referred to as creative differences. He smoked constantly and had the twitchy manner of a man always watching his back, or waiting for a shadow to catch up. Next came Clara Blaine, the late Mr. Blaine's wife, a woman half his age and twice as fragile in appearance. She had a haunted beauty about her, like a figure in a romantic painting. Lovely, yes, but you'd hesitate to touch her, for fear she might shatter. I didn't even hear anything, she told us softly, her eyes reddened. I was reading in my room, and then the shouting started. But of course, no one had reported any shouting. Curious. And finally, Doctor. Felix Borden, a tall, soft-spoken man with round glasses and a soothing voice. He had been invited by Blaine as a guest lecturer of sorts, an expert in neuroacoustics and memory imprinting. A fascinating field, Poirot said as we watched Borden speak to the housekeeper with what seemed like paternal kindness. But dangerous in the wrong hands, Hastings. The mind, like the heart, can be manipulated, especially by sound. 4 guests, 4 stories, 4 possible motives. And none of them, on the surface at least, had any reason to murder Mortimer Blaine. But as Poirot said later, as we retreated to the library to take stock, there is no such thing as coincidence, mon ami, especially not when one man is dead, another has been ruined, and the phonograph sings the song of the dead like a siren. Our next encounter with Mrs. Daphne Wren occurred in the conservatory, where she stood trimming a stubborn orchid with the exacting precision of a surgeon. The sunlight danced on the glass panes, but her presence seemed to dim the room by a degree or two. She didn't rise to greet us. "You'll forgive me, gentlemen," she said coolly, snipping away at the flower. "I find gardening rather therapeutic in times of, how shall I put it, melodrama." Poirot gave a slight bow. "Ah, madame, I would not dream of disturbing your orchids, though I confess I have always preferred the neat order of tulips. Such discipline in their bloom, n'est-ce pas?" "I assume you've come to ask about Mortimer," she said. "And no, I didn't kill him, though I dare say many wished I had." "Indeed," said Poirot, settling into a nearby chair. Mrs. Wren laid the pruning shears aside and turned to face us. "You've heard, no doubt, of our legal history. He took my invention, a prototype I'd worked on for 2 years, and registered it under his company's name while I was still negotiating the licensing. By the time I realized, it was already marketed as one of his therapeutic sonic experiences." "You sued," I said. She smiled tightly. "And lost. Judges rarely side with women who design machines." Poirot steepled his fingers. "But you were invited here. You accepted." "Of course. I am not petty, monsieur. Besides," she added, eyes narrowing, "I wanted to see what new toys he'd stolen lately." Poirot tilted his head. "And did you see anything stolen?" Mrs. Wren paused. "Just one reel, unlabeled. He wouldn't play it, said it wasn't his. But I know Mortimer. If he kept it, it was valuable." Poirot stood slowly. "Merci, madame. You have been most gracious." As we exited, he murmured, "The woman prunes her orchids with the same hand that once built sonic devices, Hastings. And that tape she noticed, it is not mentioned casually." "You think she's hiding something?" Poirot smiled faintly. "She is hiding everything. The question is, what portion of it is relevant to murder?" We found Vincent Leary in the old billiards room, though the table was covered not with green felt, but with tangled audio cables and a pair of disassembled speakers. He stood over the mess with the focused frustration of a man whose tools had betrayed him. He looked up as we entered, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Don't suppose you've come to help me fix this amp?" "Alas, monsieur," said Poirot with a pleasant smile. "My skills are not suited to rewiring, only unravelling the knots in the human mind." Leary gave a quick bark of laughter, half genuine, half defensive. "Well, you've come to the right place then. This whole house is wired for madness." Poirot's tone shifted, gently but firmly. "Monsieur Leary, I must speak to you about a certain item found in your room this morning. A reel, an audio tape." Leary's expression hardened like concrete. "Yeah?" he said. "What about it?" Poirot opened his hands. "It is identical to the one we heard the night before, the unsettling one." Leary dropped his tools with a clatter. "Then someone planted it," he snapped, "because I've never seen that reel before in my life." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you had the means, the opportunity, and dare I suggest, the motive." Leary took a step forward, eyes blazing. "Look, I hated Blaine. Is that what you want to hear? He stole my work, made millions off a sound layering technique I developed. But that doesn't make me a murderer. I didn't kill him. And I sure as hell didn't record that freak show death whisper." Poirot remained unshaken. "You are very quick to distance yourself, monsieur. That is curious." "What's curious?" Leary shot back. "Is that you all think sound is just background noise. You forget. It's a tool, a weapon. You play the wrong frequency to the wrong man, and you can tear his mind to shreds." There was silence. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Merci," he said quietly. "That is most enlightening." As we left the room, I glanced back. Leary had returned to his cables, but his hands trembled. Poirot spoke low, mostly to himself. It is the guilty man who insists too loudly that he is innocent. And it is the clever man who tells you how a murder might be done, before anyone has accused him of doing it. We found Clara Blaine seated beside the grand staircase, bathed in morning light, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She was dressed in pale grey, a shade lighter than morning black, though whether that was modesty or practicality I couldn't say. Poirot approached her gently, removing his hat. "Madame," he said softly, "may we sit with you a moment?" She nodded and gestured toward the velvet chair opposite hers. "Of course. I suppose I've spoken to nearly everyone else. Why not you?" She smiled, but her voice had that distant, brittle quality I'd often heard in people freshly touched by death. Poirot leaned forward. "You were fond of your husband." Clara hesitated. I was married to him. That's not always the same thing, is it?" "No," said Poirot. "It is not." She sighed, eyes fixed on a point far beyond the window. Mortimer was brilliant, in a way that's hard to live with. He loved control. Of sound, of surroundings, of people. Being his wife meant following his rhythm, not your own. "And yet," I interjected, "he left you everything in the will." She looked down. "Yes, he said it was because I had been loyal. But you don't know what loyalty meant to him. It wasn't love, it was obedience." Poirot studied her carefully. "Forgive me, madame, but when a man dies and the wife inherits, suspicion is not far behind." She gave a soft laugh. "I know how it looks, but I didn't kill him. If I had wanted him dead, I'd have just left. That would have wounded him more." Poirot stood slowly. "You are clever, madame, and that is more dangerous than people believe." As we walked away, I whispered, "You believe her?" "I believe," Poirot replied, "that she tells the truth, but not the whole of it. There is grief, yes, but there is also relief. And that, Hastings, is a most telling emotion." Dr. Felix Borden received us in the library, where he sat beneath a large oil painting of a stag hunt, paging through a worn volume on cognitive neuroscience. His manner was precise, his gestures spare, and he looked at Poirot with the clinical interest of a man observing a specimen under glass. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said smoothly, rising. "I've been expecting you." "Indeed, monsieur?" Poirot smiled. "You must be clairvoyant." "No," Borden replied, "just observant." Poirot chuckled. "You and I, then, we are kindred spirits." I sat to one side, feeling as though the air had thickened slightly. There was something unsettling about the man, his voice calm, his movements exact, as though he'd rehearsed them all before. "I understand," Poirot began, "that you are a man of science, but also of sensation." Borden's eyes gleamed. "Sensation is merely data filtered through perception. And perception, that is my field. You'd be astonished how easily the human brain can be led astray by sound." "You believe, then," Poirot asked, "that a voice, say, a whisper, could cause a man's heart to fail?" "Under the right conditions. Absolutely," Borden said. "Auditory hallucination, emotional anchoring, even low-frequency vibration can trigger powerful physiological reactions. Fear, Monsieur Poirot, is a language all its own." "Fascinating," Poirot said, tapping his temple. "And were those your aims in accepting Monsieur Blaine's invitation?" Borden's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mortimer was a difficult man, but he appreciated the cutting edge. He wanted to turn fear into art. I wanted to turn it into understanding. Unfortunately, he had the budget." Poirot stood. "Merci, docteur. You have enlightened me greatly." As we left, I leaned over to whisper. He didn't seem too shaken, did he? Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "No, Hastings, that is precisely what is so interesting. The man studies fear, and yet he does not feel it." By mid-afternoon, Poirot had retreated to his room, where he began his usual ritual. Shoes precisely aligned, moustache waxed to perfection, and mind whirring like a fine-tuned metronome. I found him there, perched near the fireplace, eyes half closed, fingers templed. "You look like a man in the grip of a theory," I said. He didn't open his eyes. "Non, Hastings. I'm in the grip of many facts, facts that must be arranged like music, or else they are only noise." "Such as?" He opened one eye. "Let us consider. The death occurred in a study, locked from within. The door was bolted, the windows latched, yet the phonograph was still playing when the body was discovered." I nodded, suggesting he was alone. "Or," Poirot corrected, "that someone made it appear so." He held up a finger. "Now recall the dog." "The terrier?" "Oui. The butler mentioned it barked near the study door just before midnight, something it had not done previously. Dogs, Hastings, are excellent judges of interruption." He stood and paced. "Now, the will. The new will. It was signed 2 days prior to Monsieur Blaine's death. The solicitor confirmed this morning that it was hastily arranged, favouring Clara entirely, replacing an older version that divided his estate among 3 foundations." "Coincidence?" I asked. Poirot turned, dramatic as ever. "Is anything coincidence, mon ami, when a man is found dead beside a recording that whispers his own murder?" I felt a chill, but the room was locked. He smiled. "There are many ways to lock a door, from inside and from out." Poirot glanced out the window, eyes narrow. "The more I hear of Monsieur Blaine," he said, "the more I believe someone wanted him silenced. But not brutally, not with poison or gun. No, no, this was a murder for the modern age. Sleek, psychological, and soundproof." We joined Inspector Merrick on the terrace that evening, where he was enjoying his 3rd pipe, and sounding, to my ear at least, supremely content. "No sign of foul play," he said, puffing away. "Medical records confirm Blaine had a weak heart. Doctor signed off on it. We'll close the inquest by Monday." Poirot nodded politely. "You are efficient, monsieur." "Just practical," Merrick replied. "Some men die without needing a push." "Ah," Poirot said, "but others receive the gentlest of nudges." The inspector raised a brow. "You think someone scared him to death?" Poirot shrugged. "What is fear, after all, but a stimulus to the heart?" Merrick waved him off. "No evidence of that." "Of course," Poirot said, "because the evidence was made not to be seen, but to be heard." He looked to me. "Tell me, Hastings, what do we know?" I ticked off on my fingers. Blaine dies in a locked room. A recording is playing. A second copy is found in Leary's room. Clara inherits everything. Mrs. Wren resented a lost patent. Borden is altogether unnerving. "And each," Poirot said softly, "has a reason to be present, but none to be trusted." Merrick stood. "Well, I've got my report to finish. You can spin your theories, Poirot, but I'll take facts." Poirot bowed. "As you wish. But remember, Inspector, facts are like phonograph needles. They must be placed in the right groove, or all you hear is noise." As the inspector left, Poirot turned to me. "They are too comfortable with his death, Hastings. No grief, no disbelief, only acceptance." "Well," I said, "he wasn't exactly beloved." "Precisely. And what better kind of man to kill than one no one will miss?" He looked to the horizon. "This was not a death of convenience," he said. "It was a death crafted, to vanish beneath silence." We encountered Mrs. Daphne Wren again in the morning room, seated beside an arched window with a cup of black coffee and a file of correspondence she did not bother to hide. There was something about her presence, cold, efficient, slightly disdainful, that always made me feel as though I had intruded upon a board meeting to which I was not invited. Poirot, naturally, was undeterred. "Madame," he said with a bow, "you are, I think, not a woman who is easily shaken. May I presume you have already processed the events of the past evening?" Mrs. Wren folded a page neatly in half. "Death," she said coolly, "rarely surprises me anymore, Monsieur Poirot, particularly not when it arrives dressed in inevitability." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "but inevitability is not the same as design." She met his gaze evenly. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot gestured with a small shrug. "Only that you had history with the deceased. History, as you English say, tends to leave fingerprints." Her mouth twitched. "If you're referring to the lawsuit, it was over and done with years ago, but never forgotten." "Never forgiven, perhaps," she replied calmly. "But people like Mortimer Blaine do not die for being detestable. If they did, the streets would be littered with bodies." Poirot chuckled. "You speak with admirable clarity, madame. And yet, I wonder, why did you choose to attend this weekend? Surely it must have been unpleasant to return to the home of a man who, as you once testified, intellectually pillaged your life's work." Mrs. Wren tapped a finger on the rim of her cup. "I came for closure, or perhaps to see whether he had anything else worth taking," Poirot asked softly. She leaned back, unfazed. "If I had anything left to take, Monsieur Poirot, it wouldn't be something so crude as revenge." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, but orchestration." I blinked. "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "Only that the most elegant crimes are those arranged to look like none at all." Mrs. Wren returned to her papers. "Good day, gentlemen." As we exited, Poirot whispered, "She tells the truth, Hastings, but like a surgeon, only what is absolutely necessary. Everything else, she stitches up." We next found Vincent Leary on the back terrace, nursing a coffee and scribbling into a leather-bound notebook with what I suspected was more fury than inspiration. The morning breeze tousled his hair, but the man himself remained hunched and tense, like a violin string stretched to its limit. He didn't look up as we approached. "Come to ask me again if I killed him," he muttered. Poirot sat across from him, legs crossed, utterly composed. "On the contrary, Monsieur Leary, I am here to ask you why you did not." That made Leary pause. He set the notebook down slowly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You had motive," Poirot continued. "Opportunity, technical knowledge, and a grudge that has aged to perfection. And yet, you let the man live, until he died conveniently in his own locked study." Leary gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think I'm some sort of coward?" "I think," Poirot said, "you are a man who speaks before he thinks and regrets it afterward." Leary stared at him, then exhaled heavily. "All right, I'll say it plainly. I threatened him, told him I'd destroy his reputation, crash his precious company, expose every rotten thing he ever did. And I meant it." Poirot inclined his head. "But not with murder." "No," Leary said, his voice quieter. "Not with that." "Why not?" He rubbed his face. "Because if I killed him, then I'd be done. And I didn't want that. I wanted him to live and watch it all fall apart." "A curious brand of justice," Poirot said, "but not an unfamiliar one." Leary looked away. "Anyway, I didn't do it. You believe me or not. It's all the same now." As we stood to leave, Poirot said gently, "The anger of a man like you, Monsieur Leary, it burns hot, yes, but also clean. No, I do not believe you killed him, but someone else may have watched that fire and used it as a screen." I followed Poirot back inside, puzzled. "You just let him off the hook?" Poirot shook his head. "Non, Hastings. I let him speak. The guilty man hides. The angry man explodes. And Monsieur Leary, he is all noise and no silence. Clara Blaine was not in the drawing room, nor the gardens, nor even her chambers when we asked the staff. We finally located her in a forgotten nook of the library, seated in a high-backed armchair near the fire, legs curled beneath her, a discarded tissue clenched in her hand. The sight of her gave me pause. She looked delicate, yes, but in a different light than before. Not fragile like porcelain, but like thin glass, clear, sharp-edged, and capable of cutting. Poirot approached softly. "Madame, may we?" She nodded, not looking up. "You're not going to accuse me too, are you?" "Non," Poirot replied. "Not yet." That earned a faint smile. Honesty, what a novelty. He sat across from her, steepling his fingers. "You loved your husband?" Clara hesitated. I respected him. I admired his mind. But love? I think he expected devotion more than affection. And you gave it. I gave him what he wanted. I smiled, nodded, dressed the part. I was the wife he needed to complete the picture. Poirot's brow furrowed. "And what did you need, madame?" Clara finally looked at him. "Permission to breathe." There was silence, save the slow ticking of the grandfather clock beside us. "You sound like a prisoner." "I was," she whispered, "in velvet chains." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you inherit everything." Clara nodded slowly. "He promised, said I had earned it. And you did not find that convenient?" She shook her head. "Number because it means he won. Even in death, he still controls the story." Poirot leaned forward. "Unless, of course, someone rewrote the ending." Clara blinked. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Poirot replied gently, "that you had reason to wish him gone." "But that's not the same thing, is it?" Poirot stood. "Non, madame, it is not." As we exited, I turned to Poirot. "She's not the sort, surely." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Hastings, when a woman weeps honestly, you may trust her. But when her tears are timed with the ticking of a clock, then, mon ami, you must listen more closely, not to the words, but to the silence between them." We found Doctor. Felix Borden not in a study or lecture room, but in the solarium, a space filled with filtered sunlight and the low hum of unseen electronics. He was examining a frequency modulator he'd brought with him, its components strewn carefully across a small table, like surgical instruments awaiting their turn. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, without looking up. "I presume you've come to prod at my profession." Poirot smiled. "Monsieur, I do not prod. I merely inquire, with finesse." "Then finesse away," Borden murmured, adjusting a dial. Poirot moved to stand beside him. "You are a student of fear, are you not?" "Among other things. Emotional imprinting, trauma retention, how the brain stores sound not just as data, but as meaning. And meaning, Doctor, can be manipulated." Borden looked up, his expression unreadable. "Absolutely. In the right acoustic environment, the mind becomes a canvas. Suggest a memory, apply the appropriate frequency, and what you have is not recollection, but recreation." Hastings coughed. "That sounds rather sinister." Borden gave a small laugh. "Only if you use it unethically, as with anything powerful." Poirot nodded slowly. "Tell me, Doctor, could a sound make a man's heart stop?" "In theory, yes," Borden replied, "if he had an existing condition and the stimulus induced a panic response. Subsonic frequencies can create unease, dread, even nausea. Combine that with a meaningful emotional trigger, say, a voice from the past, and yes, the effect could be catastrophic." "Fascinating," Poirot murmured. "And were you—" "Experimenting with such techniques here at Fernley?" Borden folded his arms. "Mortimer invited me for that reason. He wanted to blend fear and sound into art. I advised caution. But of course, he thought he was immune to fear. Poirot's moustache twitched, as do all men, until it arrives. There was a silence, heavy and uncertain. Hastings leaned in. Do you think he was killed by fear? Borden tilted his head. I think someone knew how to create fear. Whether they intended it to kill, that's another matter. As we left the solarium, Poirot muttered, He is not a man, Hastings. He is a frequency dressed in tweed. One moment calm, the next vibrating with implication. I frowned. Do you trust him? Poirot paused. Non, but I believe him, at least in part. The question is, which part is the truth, and which part is the sound he wants us to hear? It was Poirot's idea, naturally. We were halfway through a quiet evening at Fernley, dinner served in the music room, where soft candlelight and fine silver clashed slightly with the grim weight of our purpose, when he stood and cleared his throat. My friends, he said, I ask your indulgence. A brief demonstration, nothing more. The room grew still. Even Clara looked up from her untouched soup. Poirot stepped to the phonograph, his own machine, not the late Mr. Blaine's, and placed a reel delicately into position. This, he said, is the same recording we heard the night before. But this time, I ask that you listen, not simply hear. The difference, I think, may be instructive. He pressed a button. The room was filled once more with that ghastly breath, halting, rasping, and then the voice, He killed me. The effect was immediate and electric. Mrs. Wren gasped, clutching her pearls. That again? Must we? Vincent Leary stood abruptly, knocking over his wineglass. That's not how it sounded before. That's been altered. Clara rose to her feet and fled the room, one hand pressed tightly over her ears. Only Dr. Borden remained composed, though he tilted his head slightly, as if studying the recording analytically. Poirot let the tape play once more before stopping it. He turned to the room with the theatrical air of a magician preparing his final trick. You see, he said quietly, sound is memory, and memory is not to be trusted. Each of you heard something different, but none of you heard the truth. Leary, red-faced, pointed. You're trying to manipulate us. Poirot smiled. No, monsieur, I merely lifted the veil. Borden spoke at last. You edited the recording? Ah, Poirot's eyes twinkled. Number I did nothing to the content. I merely altered the playback speed by a fraction and used speakers with a cleaner frequency range. The rest, your reactions, are your own. He turned to Mrs. Wren. You paled, madame, because you recognized the structure of a looped edit. To Vincent, he continued, the reverb was unfamiliar, suggesting guilt or fear. And Clara, he hesitated. She heard something personal, something real. Borden crossed his arms. You've proved nothing, Poirot. Reactions are not evidence. Non, Poirot said softly. But they are revelations. And as the dinner resumed in awkward silence, I leaned toward Poirot. That was a bit theatrical, don't you think? Poirot sipped his wine. Hastings, mon ami. Sometimes the ghost must be summoned, so that the murderer may flinch. It was some time after dinner, and I found myself walking beside Poirot through the echoing halls of Fernley Court, still haunted by the tape we had heard yet again at dinner. There was something different this time. Not just the voice or the breath, but a quality, as though the message had changed. You know, I said, I think we've been missing something. That voice, it said something, Poirot. He gave me a patient look. Oui, Hastings. It said, he killed me. I recall it vividly. Yes, but that's just it. A man's dying words. Surely they must mean something. Poirot paused at the base of the staircase. You place your faith, mon ami, in the theatrical. I blinked. I place my faith in what I heard, which is more than you've done. He raised a finger. Ah, but it is not what one hears, but how one hears it. I folded my arms. Well, it sounded genuine enough to me. Poirot turned and walked slowly into the drawing room. I followed. Consider this, Hastings, he said, lowering himself into a chair. A man gasping for air, terrified, utters, "He killed me." Yes? A vivid image, a confession, a final truth. But let us ask, who recorded it? I assumed it was Mortimer himself. Recorded his own death before it happened? Poirot tilted his head. I flushed. Well, perhaps it was captured as he died. Then how is it playing in a perfect loop, without variance? Why does the whisper repeat precisely the same way, even in the breath? I sat down, a bit sheepishly. Poirot continued, voice low. You see, mon ami, this is not a confession. It is a performance, crafted with care to mimic authenticity, a sound manufactured to deceive, not a man's last truth, but someone's first lie. But who would go to such lengths? That, Poirot said softly, is what we must yet uncover. Later that night, as the household retired and silence crept in like fog through the halls, I found Poirot standing alone in the library. The fire had burned low, and he stared at it as though it whispered secrets meant only for him. He did not turn when I entered. You know who did it, don't you? I said quietly. He nodded once. We. You're certain? As certain as I am that the moon is not made of cheese. I chuckled. Then why not say it? Tell the police. Call everyone in. Poirot turned to face me, and I saw the gleam in his eye, the one that always signaled a conclusion reached and a performance yet to come. Non, mon ami, not yet. A symphony must end with its final chord. To speak now would be to ruin the music. But someone here is a murderer. Indeed, he said, but they believe they are safe, and in that belief, they may slip. He walked past me, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. I have the method. I know the motive. I see the manipulation. The last breath was not caught on tape. It was crafted to seem caught. It is an illusion, and now I must reveal the magician. And when will you do that? Poirot smiled. When everyone is present, and when the lie is ready to collapse beneath the weight of truth. He stepped into the corridor, his silhouette framed by the flickering firelight. And then, he added softly, I shall let the tape play. One final time. It was shortly after tea when Poirot, with the air of a man preparing a final performance, requested that all the guests assemble in the music room, the same place where the infamous recording had first chilled our bones. I had seen him like this before, calm, composed and twinkling, with something that was not quite amusement and not quite triumph. I believe, he said, as the last of the group settled into their seats, that it is time for clarity, no? The guests looked uneasy. Mrs. Wren sat with her back ramrod straight, her hands gloved and folded. Vincent Leary paced near the window like a caged fox. Clara Blaine lingered at the edge of the circle, visibly tense, while Dr. Borden stood apart, arms crossed and expression unreadable. Poirot, standing in the centre of the room, gently gestured to a table at his side, where a reel-to-reel phonograph stood, his own, brought specially from London. This, he announced, is not Mortimer Blaine's machine. It is mine. The recording I shall play has been transferred from the original without interference, using the exact specifications I would trust for a criminal court. He placed the reel onto the machine with delicate reverence. You will hear what you believe you have heard before. But I beg you, listen closely, for tonight we listen not with the ear, but with the little grey cells. He pressed the switch. Again, the breath. Again, the whisper. He killed me. Even knowing what was coming, I felt a shiver crawl along my spine. But Poirot, unbothered, allowed the loop to repeat once more before switching it off. Merci, he said quietly. Now then, mes amis, let us discuss truth. There was a pause, a long, tight silence. Then Clara whispered, Why are you doing this? Poirot bowed slightly. Because the time for pretending is over. Someone in this room believed themselves clever enough to kill a man and disguise it as drama. But there is one fatal flaw in a performance. He let the sentence dangle as he stepped away from the phonograph. Eventually, the curtain must fall. Let us begin, said Poirot, not with who, but with how. He looked around the room. No one moved. The recording you have just heard is a lie, he declared. Not a mistaken report, not a confused utterance, a fabrication. A small gasp escaped from Clara's lips. Poirot continued. It was constructed using 3 separate elements. The breath was taken from a 1950s clinical recording of a dying tuberculosis patient. The whisper was sourced from a child's voice, slowed and filtered. The static, from a damaged wire. Leary's face turned red. That's impossible. That would take hours of skill, Poirot finished. Indeed, but not for someone with technical expertise and an obsession with psychological triggers. He turned to Dr. Borden. Doctor, you once told me fear is a language. You also said that frequencies can shape emotion, that a person can be driven to feel dread with the right stimuli. Borden tilted his head. Hypothetically. No, monsieur, precisely. You gave Mortimer Blaine that knowledge, but he, being arrogant, chose to use it for show. You, being brilliant and dismissed, chose to use it for murder. There was a gasp from Clara. Let me demonstrate, said Poirot. He flicked a hidden switch on the phonograph. A faint, low-frequency hum filled the room, just enough to make my chest feel tight, my ears buzz. Do you feel that? Poirot asked. Mrs. Wren pressed her hand to her forehead. Now imagine it paired with the suggestion of imminent death. Imagine it engineered to strike at a man with a known heart condition. Borden's face remained still. Blaine was a megalomaniac. Poirot smiled. Oui, but his greatest crime was underestimating the man he invited. He turned to the others. Dr. Borden prepared the frequency in advance. At dinner, he played it at low volume through the ceiling-mounted speakers. Later, he placed the tape into the study, after Blaine was already dead. And the door. It was locked by a string mechanism, pulled tight from outside, then snapped. Hastings blinked. That's how he made it look like suicide. Non, mon ami. Not suicide, tragedy, but manufactured with surgical precision. Poirot turned to Borden. Your motive was rejection. He mocked your research, made you a cautionary tale. But now, monsieur, your silence has spoken volumes. Borden didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. There was a moment of stunned silence in the room after Poirot's demonstration, broken only by the faint hum of the now silent phonograph and the clink of glass as Vincent Leary poured himself a stiff drink with shaking hands. Poirot, however, remained entirely at ease, as though he had merely announced a change in the weather. And then he turned fully to Doctor. Felix Borden, who stood just beside the hearth, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across his face. It was you, Poirot said simply. From the beginning, it was always you. Borden arched an eyebrow, but did not otherwise react. I think you will find, he said coolly, that accusations without proof are merely theatre, Monsieur Poirot. But theatre, said Poirot, requires craft, no? Timing, stage design, a willing suspension of disbelief. And you, Doctor, staged this murder with all the finesse of a playwright. Borden said nothing. You alone understood the physiological effects of low-frequency audio. You alone had the skill to splice, distort, and reconstruct the sounds on the tape. You even instructed our late host on the theory, though you did not share the full implementation. Poirot walked slowly to the side table and picked up a small notepad. Blaine kept notes, you see. Sloppy ones, but enough. He referenced your ideas, fear-based conditioning, memory disruption, and something he referred to as frequency sculpting. Terms too advanced for any of the other guests, but not for you. Vincent Leary muttered, "I said he was dangerous." Poirot held up a hand. "You, Monsieur Leary, are a man of fire and reaction, but the doctor, he is the man of cold calculation. And it was precisely that, the absence of emotional response, that drew my attention." He gestured around the room. "Each of you reacted to the recording with revulsion, dread, or denial. But Dr. Borden, he was pleased, satisfied, curious." Poirot turned back to Borden. "You designed an experiment," he said softly. "But it was not science. It was a controlled collapse of a man's mind. You induced terror, precisely calibrated, to produce a cardiac arrest in a man whose health was fragile but stable. And then you wrapped it in a mystery." Borden's eyes narrowed. "Prove it." Poirot smiled. "Oh, I shall. But the brilliance of your crime, Doctor, was in its elegance. The flaw was your ego." And with that, the psychologist's expression shifted, just slightly. A tightening of the jaw, the faintest twitch in the corner of his eye. "I saw it. We all saw it. The first crack." Poirot straightened his cuffs and stepped forward as though addressing a theatre audience. "The question remains," he said. "Why? Why would a man such as Dr. Borden, esteemed in his field, go to such intricate lengths to end the life of a man like Mortimer Blaine?" He let the silence hang before answering his own question. "Because of humiliation." Borden's expression tightened. "You see, some years ago Dr. Borden presented his findings at a symposium in Geneva. His research, highly theoretical at the time, proposed that specific audio triggers could alter brain chemistry, inducing states of panic, paralysis, or emotional regression." He looked to the others in the room. The academic world was skeptical, but it was not until Mortimer Blaine published a damning article, calling Borden's work psychological poison disguised as research, that the damage was done. Borden's hands curled into fists. "He was blacklisted from funding circles," Poirot continued. "His university distanced itself. The scientific community laughed. And all because Blaine feared what the doctor's discoveries could become." Clara whispered, "You killed him for a paper?" Poirot turned to her gently. "Non, madame. He killed him for being cast out, for watching his life's work dismissed not for lack of merit, but because it frightened the wrong man." Poirot's voice grew quiet. It was not hatred alone that drove him. It was the need to prove that he was right. That sound, applied with intent and precision, could conquer reason, could silence a man without a single drop of blood. He turned again to Borden. "And so you made Blaine your final case study. You let him live in comfort, let him mock your theories, until the night came to demonstrate your thesis in practice." Mrs. Wren muttered, "This is monstrous." "On the contrary," said Poirot softly, "it is entirely human." He walked back to the center of the room. "Fear, rejection, and brilliance. These are powerful forces, and in the hands of a man who believes himself above consequence, they are deadly." Poirot turned to me. "Let the inspector know, Hastings. The truth, I think, is now quite audible." After revealing Dr. Borden's motive, Poirot turned to face the room as a whole. His voice, though gentle, now carried the unmistakable cadence of finality. "And yet," he said, "a crime as delicate as this one, so intricate, so carefully masked, requires more than opportunity and skill. It requires Camouflage. He began pacing slowly, fingertips joined. You see, mes amis, when you heard the tape, your minds leapt, naturally, to the voice, to the message. He killed me. The words are haunting, yes, but they are also distracting. He looked to Vincent Leary, who still stood rigid near the decanter. You, Monsieur Leary, were our first red herring. An angry man betrayed in business, with a violent temper and a most convenient recording discovered in your room. But the tape, it was planted, and your anger, too loud to be useful. A proper murderer must not roar, he must whisper. Poirot turned to Mrs. Daphne Wren, who watched him with icy calm. And you, madame, you gave us motive and mystery. A brilliant woman robbed of invention, humiliated in court. But your war with Blaine had ended long ago. And your presence here? Ah, non. It was for observation, not vengeance. The true villain needed you here, not as a threat, but as a shield. Mrs. Wren inclined her head, a ghost of a smile on her lips. And then, Poirot said softly, there was Madame Blaine. Clara, seated nearest to the phonograph, looked up. You were the perfect distraction. The grieving widow, the beautiful victim, the beneficiary of the will. Suspicion, naturellement, would circle you. But I noticed something else. The tears, they came at the right times, but never too much. Sincere grief, yes, but relief as well. Clara flinched. Yet even your inheritance was meant to be a screen, a motive, handed to you like a prop in a stage play. Dr. Borden needed you to draw the eye, to keep us from examining the sound too closely. Poirot returned to the centre of the room. You were all used, not as accomplices, but as scenery. And the more dramatic the backdrop, the less likely we were to notice the surgeon behind the curtain. He paused, his voice quiet. And that, mes amis, is what nearly allowed a murderer to slip away unseen. Poirot moved back to the phonograph, his fingertips gliding across the machine as though it were an old friend, or perhaps a witness. This, he said, was the murder weapon. He turned to face us. There were no bruises, no blood, no poison, no sign of forced entry or violence. And yet Mortimer Blaine is dead. Why? Because sound, mes amis, can do more than entertain. It can kill. We all sat in stunned silence. Poirot continued, voice crisp and calm. Doctor. Borden understood this. He understood Blaine's heart condition, perhaps from casual conversation or observation. He knew the exact frequency that would destabilize the heart rate, slowly at first, then rapidly, until the heart seized in fear. He looked at Borden. You didn't need to lift a hand. At dinner, you introduced the subsonic frequency, inaudible but deeply felt, enough to cause discomfort, restlessness, and in Blaine's case, alarm. Poirot began to pace. Then, in the solitude of his study with the door locked, perhaps by his own hand, perhaps staged, you left the final ingredient, the doctored tape. He gestured to the reel on the table. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a lie designed to feel true. A breath, a death rattle, a cry of accusation. And Mortimer Blaine, already on edge, already weakened by the earlier exposure, sat down in his chair and died. Poirot paused. The official verdict, a heart attack. And technically it was, but what it truly was orchestration. He stopped beside Borden, looking down at the man who had remained eerily still. You staged a murder that no one would suspect, a killing without a weapon, but not without intent. The most dangerous crime of all, one wrapped in art, masked as misfortune, executed with scientific detachment. Borden gave a small clinical nod. And you found all this through psychology. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Non, monsieur, through observation, and the greatest clue of all, The tape did not feel like a man dying. It felt like a man pretending to die. A long silence followed Poirot's final words. Even the candles seemed to flicker less brightly, as though the air itself were unsure how to proceed. Dr. Borden sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap. No protest, no denial, only stillness. It was I who finally broke the quiet. "Poirot," I whispered, "how could you possibly know it was fake? It sounded so real." Poirot turned to me, smiling faintly. "Ah, Hastings, my friend. You listen with the ears but not with the mind. The gasp, the whisper. They were too precise, too theatrical. When a man dies, he does not perform his demise. He succumbs to it." He turned to the group. That tape was not messy. It was not breathless or broken. It was constructed, calibrated, engineered. And so I asked myself, who here does not fear silence? Who here shapes fear into form? His gaze settled on Borden, and the answer, mon ami, was most clear. Clara exhaled sharply. Then it was all theatre. Poirot nodded. "Indeed, a drama in 3 acts. Suggestion, sound, and silence. But even the finest illusion collapses when one observes the details." He took the reel from the machine and placed it gently into a case. "This," he said softly, "is not the voice of the dead. It is the voice of deception. But the little grey cells, they are not so easily misled." I watched as Poirot straightened his tie and reached for his hat. "And so," he said, "justice shall be served, not by confession, but by deduction." He turned to leave, and paused at the doorway, casting one final glance back at the group. "A man may murder with a blade, a bullet, or a breath," he said, "but it is the silence afterward that tells us the truth." And with that, he walked into the night. It was all over. At least, so it seemed. After Poirot's brilliant deduction and his flawless monologue, a thick silence had settled over the music room. The guests remained frozen in their seats, stunned not only by the revelation of Dr. Borden's guilt, but by the sheer cleverness with which he had committed his crime. Clara sat wide-eyed, Mrs. Wren pale, and Leary, well, Leary still looked as if he wanted to punch someone, just not quite sure who. And then, without warning, Dr. Borden moved. It wasn't a dramatic dash, mind you. No leaping through windows or sweeping cloaks. Just a quiet pivot, a calm stride toward the corridor, and the outer door beyond. Poirot did not follow. He merely raised one eyebrow and muttered, "He chooses now to leave? How very American." As luck would have it, or perhaps fate, I had stepped into the hallway moments earlier, hoping to retrieve my coat before the draft gave me another cold. I turned the corner at precisely the wrong time, and found myself face to face with Borden as he tried to pass. "Ah, Doctor." "Borden," I said cheerfully, startled. "I say, going somewhere?" He attempted to sidestep me. I shifted the same way. He tried the other. So did I. We engaged in what can only be described as an accidental waltz of confusion, until Borden stumbled slightly, lost his footing on the Persian rug, and crashed into a side table with a heavy grunt. I blinked. Oh, goodness. Poirot appeared behind me, calm as ever. "Bravo, Hastings," he said, surveying the scene. "Your instincts, they are like a bulldog with a monocle, rare, but most effective." "I didn't mean to," I began. Poirot raised a hand. "Nevertheless, you have done what the British police may have fumbled. Voilà." 2 uniformed officers arrived shortly after, summoned discreetly earlier in the day. Borden said nothing as he was led away, still composed, still dignified, though I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, not regret, but defeat. Poirot, satisfied, straightened his cuffs. "And so," he murmured, "the final act closes with applause for our most unlikely hero." I wasn't sure whether to thank him or object. Later, as the evening drew to a close and the guests retired one by one, Poirot and I found ourselves once more in the study, where it had all begun. The phonograph sat on the desk, now silent. Beside it, the reel rested in its case like an artifact from a darker age. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his expression unusually solemn. "You know, Hastings," he said quietly, "there was a time when murder came with blood, with noise, with confrontation, a dagger, a revolver, a vial of poison." He tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "But now, we see a different kind of crime, one that leaves no fingerprints, one that arrives with a whisper and departs with silence." I nodded. "It's chilling, really. Sound," he said, "is emotion, memory, fear. In the wrong hands it becomes a weapon invisible and undeniable. A man like Borden. He did not kill with hate. He killed with precision, with theory. He treated death as an equation." Poirot crossed to the desk and gently touched the reel. This tape, this fabricated final breath, was not evidence. It was misdirection. And yet, how easily we were seduced by it. He turned to me, his gaze sharp. "We must beware, mon ami. In an age of machines, the truth is not always what is said, but what is designed to be heard." I felt a chill at that. Poirot took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "But the little grey cells," he said, "do not fear machines. They remain ever sharp, ever curious, and in the end, they prevail." He glanced at the fire once more. "Still," he added, "I do not think I shall listen to the radio for a while." The next morning brought with it a peculiar calm. The manor, so full of whispers, suspicion, and echoes, seemed almost peaceful now. The wind had died down, and the tapes were packed away, sealed and labelled as evidence. It was Clara Blaine who surprised us most. She requested that everyone gather in the breakfast room. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but her words were firm. "I've spoken with the solicitor," she said. "The will stands. Everything, this house, the equipment, the assets, they are mine now." Leary raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Wren merely nodded. "But," Clara continued, "I don't want it." There was a murmur. "I'm donating Fernley Court," she said, "to Cambridge University, the Department of Acoustic Ethics. They'll study what happened here, not to exploit it, but to understand it. And I hope to prevent anything like this from happening again." Poirot's moustache twitched approvingly. "It is a wise decision, madame," he said. "To turn tragedy into purpose, that requires strength." Clara smiled faintly. "He built this place to control. I'd rather it be used to liberate." And with that she stood, her eyes clear, her voice steady. "I want peace, not echoes." I watched her go, and for the first time, I believed she might finally find it. It was some hours later, as we packed our things in the guest quarters, that I finally asked the question I'd been holding on to since the night before. "Poirot," I said, "do you remember when you first suspected Dr. Borden? I mean, really suspected him, not just as a possibility, but as the one." Poirot was folding a cravat with such meticulous care you'd have thought it were a map to buried treasure. "But of course, Hastings," he replied without looking up. "It was during our first conversation, in the solarium." I blinked. "That early?" "Oui." He said something quite interesting, more than once. He spoke not of what was frightening, but of how fear could be crafted. I frowned, trying to recall. "He sounded theoretical," I said. "Detached." "Exactly." Poirot looked at me sharply. "When the others heard the tape, they were repelled, disturbed, even angry. But Borden? Ah, none. He was delighted. He admired it. Not for what it said, but for how it said it." He picked up the sealed evidence envelope containing a duplicate of the fabricated tape. No innocent man reacts to a supposed cry of murder with clinical appreciation, Hastings. That is not horror, that is pride. And pride, mon ami, is most revealing when worn by the guilty. He placed the envelope gently in his valise. It is always the smallest detail, he added. A twitch of the lip, a word too polished, a smile too satisfied. Borden could not help himself. He had not merely committed a crime, he had composed it. I shook my head. It's terrifying, Poirot. He smiled. Then let us be thankful, Hastings, that even the most intelligent criminal cannot help but admire his own signature. The next morning, we left Fernley Court under a pale blue sky, the clouds having finally given way to spring's tentative warmth. The trees no longer whispered. The wind no longer carried secrets. As the car pulled away from the estate gates, I leaned back in my seat, arms folded. I must admit, Poirot, I said, it still gives me chills. That recording, the breath, the voice, and to think, it was all fake. Poirot was quiet a moment, gazing out the window. Ah, but that is where you are wrong, mon ami, he said. I turned. What do you mean? He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, unmarked tape reel, different from the one given to the police. There were 2 reels in the drawer, he said softly, identical in casing, but not in content. One was doctored. The other was original. I stared. And you didn't tell the police? No, Poirot said, tucking the reel away. Because this one does not accuse. It does not whisper, he killed me. It whispers, I killed him. My jaw dropped. But then Blaine, Poirot shook his head. Non. It was a confession of a different kind. A rehearsal. A man playing with power, with illusion. Perhaps he planned to stage his own murder. Perhaps something darker. He looked at me. But it does not matter now. The truth would serve only confusion. And Monsieur Blaine, he has already paid the final price. The countryside slipped past us as Poirot leaned back with a sigh. Mon ami, he said at last, the dead may speak through breath or tape, but the living, they lie with flair. And with that, the last mystery faded into silence. And so, mon ami, the truth, like sound, travels in waves. It may echo, distort, or be cleverly concealed, but it always arrives in the end. In this case, it was not the breath of a dying man that revealed the crime, but the calm delight of the living. A fabricated gasp, a theatrical whisper, a frequency of fear, all unraveled by the one thing no murderer can fully control, the psychology of human behavior. For Hercule Poirot, the little grey cells do not chase shadows, they illuminate them. Well, Poirot, I suppose next time someone plays a strange tape at dinner, I'll be sure to duck under the table rather than analyse the acoustics. What do you think was the single detail that truly gave Dr. Borden away? Was it his calm reaction to the tape, his cryptic theories on fear, or something subtler still? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your theories, detectives. If you enjoyed this Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more thrilling detective stories to life, every single week. And remember, the truth is never silent. It's just waiting to be heard. More classic mysteries are on the way. Stay tuned.